Robertson used multiple lanterns to achieve his effects, and also used rear projection, just as Philandor had done. Assistants would move their lanterns back and forth and to and fro to give the impression of rapid movement across the screen. People hidden behind the velvet curtains played eerie music, whispered creepy things, or even used ventriloquism to throw their voices into the audience. The performance ended with a grand finale called The Fate That Awaits Us All, where a scythe-wielding skeleton rushed toward the audience. It scared the fucking shit out of people. As the 19th century dawned, magic lanterns lost much of their novelty. They weren't particularly shocking anymore, and the secrets of the phantasmagoria were now broadly understood by the general public. Nonetheless, lantern shows exploded in popularity, so lanternists adapted to the times. Instead of terrorizing their audiences, they began to entertain and educate them, particularly children. And the proliferation of magic lanterns brought exciting new innovations. Lanternists were no longer limited by still images. With the clever use of levers, cranks, and overlapping slides, they could make images move. How do you do, ma'am? How do you do? How do you do, ma'am? Oh no, what's that? It's a mouse. Don't go into his mouth. Oh no! Photography was invented in 1839, and in the 1850s, two German-American brothers named William and Frederick Langenheim came up with a way to print photographs on glass, which could then be turned into magic lantern slides. Projected photographs began as a theatrical gimmick, but quickly grew to serve an educational purpose, very much the ancestor of today's documentaries. Travel shows were especially popular. Lanternists could show you what it was like to take a trip down the Nile, or hike the Great Wall of China, or go on an expedition to darkest Peru. During the Civil War, lanternists updated the paying public on the latest news from the front lines, projecting Matthew Brady tintypes in vivid detail. A crucial artistic development accompanied these proto-documentaries. For centuries, lantern shows had been essentially random, unrelated images, usually presented in random order. But in the Victorian era, that started to change. Lantern shows became more and more sophisticated, and lanternists became much more focused on telling a story. The invention of binaural lanterns, basically magic lanterns with two lenses, allowed for smooth cuts and cross dissolves, so lanternists could change a scene from day into night, from an exterior view to an interior one, and even show multiple events happening simultaneously. By the 1870s, lanternists had laid the basic groundwork for cinema. All that was needed now was for photographic technology to catch up. Almost immediately after the birth of photography, inventors started tackling the problem of how to make photographs move. The first experiments were extremely rudimentary, little more than a flipbook animation. Subjects were photographed multiple times, with incremental changes of position adjusted between frames. Then the individual photographs were attached to a rotating disc called the phenakistoscope, that when spun would create the illusion of movement. But it wasn't a true moving photograph. The often overlooked French scientist Louis Duhauron, who invented both the first process of color photography and the stereoscopic 3D technology I've been using throughout this whole video, envisioned a motion picture camera all the way back in 1864.
The observer would believe that he sees only one image, which changes gradually by reason of the successive changes of form and position of the objects, which occur from one picture to the other, even supposing that there be a slight interval of time during which the same object was not shown. The persistence of the luminous impressions upon the eye will fill this gap. There will be, as it were, a living representation of nature, and the same scene will be reproduced upon the screen with the same degree of animation. By means of my apparatus, I am enabled especially to reproduce the passing of a procession, a review of military maneuvers, the movements of a battle, a public fete, or a theatrical scene.
Though he filed a patent for it, Duhauron never built his motion picture camera. The science just wasn't quite there yet. But about 10 years later, a photographer in California made an astonishing breakthrough. You know, before 1873, no one actually knew how horses run. Do they lift all four legs up off of the ground as they leap? If so, do they tuck their legs in or splay them out? It's impossible to tell with the naked eye. To settle the question once and for all, former California Governor Leland Stanford hired renowned photographer Edward Muybridge to try to devise a way to capture a photograph of a trotting horse in motion. This had never been done before. You've probably heard stories about how people in the Civil War era, for instance, had to sit stock still when having their photographs taken for 15 to up to 30 seconds to allow enough light to get into the camera to capture a viable image. Subjects in motion during long exposures appear blurry in the final image, so to capture a photo of a horse mid-trot, Muybridge outfitted his camera with a custom shutter that would expose the photographic plate behind it for 1/500th of a second, an unprecedented speed. An exposure that fast would require a huge amount of light, so Muybridge hung bed sheets on either side of the racetrack to reflect as much sunlight into the camera as possible. Stanford's horse Occident was trained to trot through the corridor of bed sheets without flinching, and after 3 days of tests, Muybridge finally captured a visible image. That first photograph was never published and has sadly not survived. It was a bit blurry, but it clearly showed Occident with all 4 legs up off of the ground at the same time. But Muybridge was unhappy with the results and wanted to tackle the experiment again. It would take years for him and Occident to reunite. Muybridge got into some legal trouble after murdering his wife's lover, but it was ruled a justifiable homicide, and in 1877 he returned to Stanford's ranch to try again. Muybridge modified his shutter to double its speed and took another photograph of Occident trotting, but it still wasn't enough. He wanted to take a sequential series of photographs that, when put together, would serve as a complete study of a horse in motion. The following year, Muybridge returned to Stanford's ranch armed with 12 cameras. He set them at 21-inch intervals along the racetrack. Attached to each was a length of string that stretched across the track at a height of 3 feet. When the running horse's breast snapped each string, it would trigger the shutter of each camera. And on June 15, 1878, a jockey named Gilbert Dom mounted a running mare called Sally Gardner and rode it through Muybridge's contraption. Muybridge later invented a device called the zoopraxiscope, basically a combination of a spinning phenakistoscope and a magic lantern that could successfully project his series of sequential photographs. He called his creation the horse in motion. Unlooped, the horse in motion was less than a second long, but it was the first movie ever made. Motion picture technology advanced rapidly over the next 20 years. Muybridge continued to make movies, which spurned enormous public interest in the science of the motion of living things. A French physiologist named Etienne Jules Marey had been studying the motion of birds for years at that point, and inspired by Muybridge, he invented in 1882 the photographic rifle, a handheld camera that was capable of taking a series of pictures on a revolving disc of photographic plates. This isn't a photographic rifle, by the way, it's just a rifle. Marey shot all sorts of animals in movement. His favorites were birds, but famously, he also figured out how cats always land on their feet. In 1888, George Eastman invented film. Marey eagerly acquired this new technology and applied it to his work. Eastman had intended film to be used for conventional photography, so Marey had to come up with a way to project a motion picture shot on film. He labored for years at the problem, and finally constructed a device called the chronophotographic projector. It wasn't without its problems. Film at the time, the negatives were unevenly spaced, and so the image would play back in a jumpy, jerky way. But it worked. Muybridge may have made the first movies, but Marey made the first films. In Paris in 1889, Marey shared the results of his experiments with an American tourist named Thomas Edison. In 1891, Edison's engineers in New Jersey invented the kinetoscope, which was the world's first commercial motion picture viewing system. Basically, it was a big cabinet, and it functioned much like a peep show. There was an apparatus where you stuck your eyes and you looked in and you saw the film playing back. Edison's team made several classics for the kinetoscope, including Dixon Greeting, Fred Ott's Sneeze, and Newark Athlete. Masterpieces. The kinetoscope was an enormous success, and motion picture arcades started popping up in major cities all over America. Kinetoscopes were common sights in the mid-1890s, especially in bars, restaurants, and hotel lobbies. Edison made a fortune, and he became convinced that peep shows were the way of the future, and that projected movies could simply never compete. He was very, very wrong. Back across the Atlantic, 2 brothers in France named Auguste and Louis Lumière were hard at work on yet another unprecedented invention. The Lumières were businessmen first, and they made their living running a factory that manufactured dry plates for photography. During the winter of 1895, the brothers enlisted an engineer to build them a combination camera and projector. They called it the cinematograph. Their father, Antoine Lumière, immediately recognized the machine's potential for mass entertainment, but the brothers were skeptical. They had nothing but contempt for the bohemian world of actors, musicians, and artists, and saw the cinematograph as being more respectable than that. It should take on a more scientific and industrial role. But Daddy wore the brothers down and at last obtained their consent for a public demonstration. Antoine made the arrangements for a paid screening on December 28, 1895, at the Grand Café in Paris. December 28th came. It was a cold and rainy day, and only about 35 people showed up. The audience took their seats, the projector whirred to life, and this is what they saw. They screened 9 other short films that day, each under a minute long. They probably didn't show the famous one of the train entering the station, and contrary to popular belief, people did not get up and run screaming in horror from the theater. As we've seen, late 19th century audiences were actually pretty accustomed to motion pictures in some form. But still, this was impressive. This was different. A dark room, a large gathering of people, huge images, painted in light. Its labor had dragged on for centuries, but at long last, the art of cinema had emerged from out of the vagina of imagination.
Sir, you can't be in here. The theater's closed.
It's all right, I'm leaving.
If you don't, I'm going to call security.
No need to do that. I'm going.
Please do.
Just go out the back way.
Thank you.
All right, I'm leaving. In attendance at the Grand Café that night was a man called Georges Méliès. Méliès was a magician, like the phantasmagorists before him. He had used magic lanterns in his magic shows before. But in cinema, he saw endless possibilities. Méliès acquired a projector in London early in 1896 and immediately set about making movies. His first films were imitations of the Lumière brothers' work, called actualities, because they depicted mundane, real-life events. While filming just such an actuality on a busy Paris street, Méliès' camera malfunctioned. It took him about a minute to fix the machine, and he kept rolling. Later, when he projected the film, he made an amazing discovery. Méliès had accidentally discovered the jump cut.
On projecting the spliced film, I suddenly saw a carriage turn into a nurse, and the men become women. The substitution trick, called the mid-shot trick, had been found.
To be fair, William Dixon of the Edison Company was the first to use the jump cut in his short The Execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, but Méliès took the idea and ran with it, and created some truly dazzling special effects. His first uses of jump cuts were primitive, but he refined the idea and used other methods, such as double exposures, to pull off illusions on film that you could never do on stage. If the Lumieres had given birth to cinema, Méliès realized its potential. Through constant experimentation, his effects became more elaborate and more convincing, and in 1899 he started to apply them to narrative fiction. That year he directed a 6-minute adaptation of Cinderella, which was the first film ever to tell a complete story in a series of connected, dramatized scenes. He made hundreds more short films, each more elaborate than the last. In 1902, he directed his masterpiece, A Trip to the Moon. Heavily inspired by the work of Jules Verne, A Trip to the Moon tells the story of a group of French astronomers who travel to the lunar surface in a bullet-shaped spacecraft shot out of a giant cannon. Once there, they enter a cave and are captured by aliens. The aliens present them to their king, but Méliès' character throws the king on the ground, which causes him to explode and allows them to escape, pursued relentlessly by the aliens. The astronomers board their spacecraft and escape at the last moment. Falling back to Earth, the bullet plunges into the ocean, but they're towed to shore by a steamship and given a hero's welcome back in Paris. A Trip to the Moon was completely unprecedented, and the special effects were dazzling. In many ways, they still are. It was a worldwide success and demonstrated the unique advantages of this new medium as a tool for visual storytelling. In 1905, the first movie theater, called the Nickelodeon, opened in Pittsburgh, and by 1910 there were more than 10,000 in the United States alone. Movies were here to stay, and the public couldn't get enough of them. Even today, moving images continue to captivate us, probably more so now than ever before. How much of your day do you spend staring at a moving image on a screen? Probably too much. Just because it's mundane doesn't mean that it's not spectacular. And like junkies, we keep going back for more. The only difference, really, between you watching this video and Benvenuto Cellini cowering in terror from demons in the Colosseum is that you know it's a trick.
Some good old fashioned linoleum. Get some linoleum done.
and Tarkov, we had a bit of a scare at the Nice Guy News headquarters because we thought that they were going to roll back inversions for Escape from Tarkov, indicating that there was a significant issue. Turns out they did not roll back. However, this still isn't patch 12.8, and we have heard absolutely nothing about patch 12.8 yet, even though we are actually past the date that we theoretically should have seen it. Before we get into a discussion about this, I do want to point out that they did move that lobby report button, so that's good, and it looks like they made a bunch of fixes as well. So no, they're not dead, and if you want to take a positive away from this, they are at least thinking of the most discussed issues since everybody was asking for that change. Not to mention on top of all of this, at least they are actually pushing some kind of update to keep things moving. So all things considered, that's good. Now going back to 12.8, it can just pop up tomorrow, sure, but they never explained what would be in it. BSG has always had some kind of a press release or live stream or something ahead of patches to talk about what's coming, and there's been no word on even that yet. So best case scenario, BSG just feels like skipping that part, and we'll see 12.8 pop up unannounced any day now. Worst case scenario, we're still a couple weeks out to the point that they aren't even ready to talk about what will be in it officially. I, more than most, fully understand that ish happens. Important people get sick, quit, get fired, even make big mistakes that delay the whole show. What worries me is the lack of communication about it, then act like nothing's wrong and ignoring it. So yeah, I'll call them out about it. The fact that they are still here and pushing updates is great, so what I'm not going to do is disrespect them publicly, call them names, and be all toxic. If I had the opportunity for them to actually listen, I would just ask why the silence. That's it. Because again, it's weird that we haven't heard anything at all. So here's some educated guesses to help do my best to explain what could be happening, of which there's 3. Unity 19 problems, Unity review problems, and team problems. So for patch 12.8, BSG was going to try to move to Unity 19, and the possibilities of issues that they could hit there are endless. Worst case scenario, they move really far down that development branch and hit a major problem that either scraps a ton of work or makes them realize it just won't work entirely, creating significant delays. So that's one thing that I can think of, but then BSG also recently was getting reviewed by a team from Unity to help clean up production or otherwise just improve the project overall. So who knows what they found, and maybe any issues that came up take a lot of effort or time to fix. Then there's the team problems, which should be easy to understand with times like these, as everyone is on edge these days, so hopefully they're just staying positive. Let's just hope that none of that is true, and the PR guy took a vacation and told an intern to not post anything and just retweet people with lots of followers on Twitter, because that's kind of what's happening. On a lighter note, Presley ran a 100-player factory tournament yesterday that was a ton of fun to watch, and there for sure will be more of those to come, because all things considered, it actually went very well. I got a bunch of people tagging and asking me why I wasn't selected, but I would have had to apply myself to get in, which I never did. It was not invite-based, and I wanted to sit this first one out just to see how it goes. I tend not to be the first person in on these kinds of things, so we'll see what happens for the next year. So if you missed out and you wanted to see some clips or even the entire live stream, there's plenty of links all over the BSG Twitter feed. So a complete guess here, but hey, maybe BSG purposely delayed 12.8 so that this tournament wouldn't hit any problems. Fingers crossed we hear something this week, and I'll let you guys know more once I do. Otherwise, that was today, September 7th, 2020, in Escape.
Where are you going? What are you going to do? Just throw your life away like it was nothing?
I'm not going there to die. I'm going to find out if I'm really alive. I have to do it, Faye.
Bye.